Anna, so nice to see you again. It's been, I think, about a year and a half or 2 years, somewhere along that line. I first interviewed you when your Ethel Rosenberg biography came out, and I was mesmerized. And also, I had shared an interest with you about how it all happened. And I still think of that interview with you as one of my best interviews. You're never afraid to
Oh,
actually show more than just the book. So we said we would do another interview. It's a couple years later. And rather than waiting till the next book comes out, because you're working on the Women Orchestra of Auschwitz now, right? Aren't you?
I absolutely am. Everybody said to me when I wrote about Ethel, why did I choose such a dark subject? And here I am, I've chosen something even darker. But I just think if you call yourself a historian and you look back on the last century, which is my area of interest, how can you not write about these very dark times? It's just what we have to do. So you steel yourself because I feel it's important and it matters. Especially there are two women still alive, one who's
Really? I didn't
98,
know
the
that.
other
Wow.
one who is 100.
Wow.
So it's
Wait,
important
I have to
to.
ask two questions. What instruments did they play?
Well, amazingly, the one who is 98 in London played the cello, and it was the only bass instrument in the orchestra. So she was absolutely crucial. And she's very clear that that is what protected her and saved her life when she was in the infirmary with typhus. People, A, gave her an identity. She was known as the cellist. So that helped her. But she absolutely had to be saved to be protected because they needed her very badly. The other woman did play the violin, but she contracted an abscess on her neck. And rather than let her go to the gas chambers, the conductor, Alma Rosé, protected her and found another job for her, copying music and generally being her assistant. So there was a
Interesting.
role for her,
Yeah.
even if she didn't actually play.
You know what else is interesting about the cellist is back then there were not a lot of women cellists.
Precisely.
You know,
Certainly not in orchestras. If you look at the Vienna State Orchestra, it's very recent that they've had cellists. But
well,
it
I
it
told
was.
you, before we started taping that in college I studied the Holocaust extensively. My graduate work was on the Holocaust, and here you are, Ethel Rosenberg and the Holocaust. And once again, I just can't tell you how much I admire the work you're doing. When do you anticipate the book's going to be out?
Well, I'm just about finishing a first draft, and I hope it'll be published in spring 2025 because that'll be the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the camps. My father, as it happens, was in Belsen, where the remnants of the orchestra were taken to Bergen-Belsen,
Wait.
and
He was he was taken to Belsen, or he was
he was a
liberated?
he was a British tank
Uh,
commander. And when I finally decided it was about time, I researched his life and I found in his own handwriting that he was in charge of sending the Churchill flamethrower tanks in to destroy the lice ridden huts on the very day, May the 24th, that the remnants of the orchestra were giving a Red Cross concert. It was just after the liberation. The idea that my father had been there when these women were there was absolutely visceral. And so I just had to write this book, and that was
did
the
he ever
immediate
discuss it when
prompt.
you were growing up? Did you ever talk about it?
Oh, I'm so ashamed. I knew he had been in Belsen, but he wouldn't talk about it like so many of that
None of
generation.
them
He
did. It's true. It's
he
true.
he always downplayed it. So I rather thought, oh, he just passed through. He wasn't there at the liberation. I'm distraught that I didn't discuss it with him.
The other thing, Anne, that's so important is as the world takes on these, conservative versus liberal, points of view that are not based on reality in so many areas on both sides. We'll give you both sides. The fact that this comes out now, in 2 years, I think it's so important because we have to continue to make sure that factual information comes out about some of the atrocities that have been thrown at the world. So I'm really glad you're doing the book. I can't wait to interview you in 2025. Couldn't you move it up a little
Uh,
bit? I mean, really.
I wish, but I think the 80th anniversary will be the last chance to find people who were alive. And while there are still deniers, how can that be? A factual history is so important, which is why, as I said to you, I shall write it in as straightforward a way as possible. You don't need to exaggerate, you don't need to embellish the
Well, you
story.
don't even need your point of view. Everybody can make their own from a place of honor and whatever. So anyway, best of luck with that. I do think you should move it
Thank
up a
you.
little bit. But anyway, that's all right. Now, but here's what I wanted to talk to you today. As I look at the body of your work, and you've written a number of books, but let's just walk through the beginning to now. Okay. So you started with women's samplers. And as it so happens, I have a new person that I'm working with who has one of the strongest sampler collections in America. And her vision and her mission, her name is Alexandra Peters. Her vision and her mission is she wants to really make sure that people understand that samplers were not really revered by men, so they don't have their proper place in history. And as a result, we really need to look at them now and elevate them as historical markers. So here you are. You started with women's samplers. I think that was in the late 90s, wasn't it? Okay. Then you went to Enid Bagnold, who's a writer who's still not getting her due, and probably no one who's listening or watching has even heard of her. Then you went to Laura Ashley. Okay. My whole house in the 80s was Laura Ashley. So not anymore. Okay. Then one of my personal favorites was Battling for News, the rise of the female correspondent in the field. Okay, Mother Teresa, and we're not talking about why don't we bow down and pray to her every day. You gave us a vision of Mother Teresa outside of the talk about fake news of some of everybody's position for it. Okay, then William Banker, the only man you really brought in here. From Scandal to Country Home, Gem Creator. I didn't read that book, probably won't, but okay. And then this is where you get really serious. You got Jenny Churchill, Winston's mother. You've got that woman, the Duchess of Windsor, and even the title you chose, that woman, the Duchess of Windsor, really infers to the point of view that society had about it was all her fault, as if he had no agency as king of England, Okay, then the Parisians living in Paris, Parisian women leading up to and through World War II, and then Ethel Rosenberg, and then the women's orchestra of Auschwitz yet to come. Okay, I'm going to start out with the big question. Is there a link for all of these people? Is there a link between them? Is there?
Well, of course there is. So the outlier, William Banks, was because after 5 books about women, I just thought, hey, I don't want to spend the rest of my career being totally typecast. So I had to leave my agent, leave my publisher, and it was a really interesting story. It's very historically based. However, I was quickly told I was very foolish, that people expected me to write about women. And it wasn't as if I didn't want to write about women. I did. I just didn't want to be restricted. So, of course, that's the link.
Wait. Let me understand this, because we're going to be publishing this in 2 places. One is My Ladies Who Launch, but the other one is we have a publishing arm for my company, and we publish books. Okay, are you saying that you had to change your agent and your publisher to do that book? Tell me what.
Yeah.
And it was that important to you? I mean, talk to me a little bit about what that looked like, and what year are we talking about? Would that happen today?
Well, lots of things wouldn't happen. I wouldn't get a publisher to write a book about a gay man, because I would be told that that's not my story to tell. So, of course, it wouldn't happen in quite the same way. I came across this story, and I'm telescoping slightly, but the agent and publisher I had, and I've now gone back to them, to Weidenfels, felt that I have a new agent, but I've gone back to the old publisher, just felt that my reputation and books they could sell by me were about women. And actually, that's what I'm comfortable writing. So it was no hardship to go back to that and to look at women who were mothers, sisters, wives, women who did have influence, but who had to use their influence in a roundabout way, is what I love doing. I mean, Mother Teresa, goodness me, she used her influence by saying she was a pencil in God's hands. I mean, how much greater can your influence be?
It can't.
Laura
It can't. And by
Ashley.
the way, it's one of my favorite books because you're the only one who brought her alive to me in a way that I really can admire her for the woman she was. Every woman, they have that great line, history was never made by, nice women, or nice women don't make history, or whatever that is. And the women that you describe, one of the interesting things about them is there's sacrifice and there's compromise. And sometimes that compromise is very close to the line of not acceptable. And I think she's one of those people who had to do that. And her compromise line, I think it kept moving as she was trying to do more and more. But aside from that, so what you're saying is the common denominators, you like to write about women who accomplish things in an unusual way?
I think all my books are revisionist. They're about women, really, who haven't been given their due. I mean, Enid Bagnold, who is the author of The Chalk Garden, but National Velvet, which brought Elizabeth Taylor to stardom, is known today. She was an absolutely fascinating writer, and this story about National Velvet is deeply feminist. It's about a girl who has to cut off her hair to be a jockey in the Grand National, which is this big race which didn't allow women. And here's Enid in the 1930s who imagined this story, that actually a woman jockey could win this race, but she'd have to disguise herself as a boy. Now, the first woman to win the race was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, perhaps. It was in the middle of lockdown. How advanced that thinking was. That's a wonderful story. I mean, no wonder Elizabeth Taylor was so determined to be in it and forced herself to grow a few inches. She recognized it, as did Elizabeth Taylor's mother and the Metro Goldwyn Mayer who made the film. It's a truly wonderful story, and it stacks up today, but nobody's heard of Enid Bagnold.
Well, no one looks at National Velvet as a feminist role. And I think one of the great films of all time is Silence of the Lambs, because it's a woman who is facing all kinds of men and having to save women, and she has to maneuver through them. Some of them are evil, but some of them are not. Crawford's not an evil man, but he's stupid when it comes to women and how that all, it's one of the great feminist roles, and it's why Jodie Foster insisted on begging them to let her play it. But I love what you're saying about that, because it's so true. And now, do you consider, we've got to move on. I've got so many things to talk to you about. And do you consider yourself one of those women?
Who uses influence in a not straightforward way, probably. In that I was brought up by relatively elderly parents, because they'd waited to get married until after the war, so they were in their 40s. And so, the idea was that a girl should become a secretary and arrange flowers. And I'm so grateful that I was sent on a secretarial course, because my typing is extremely fast. But yes, the reason I wrote, well, first of all, Samplers, and then Enid Bagnold was my first serious biography, was because I was taken on as a foreign correspondent at Reuters. I was the first woman that they took on their graduate trainee scheme, but I was the first woman they sacked when I got pregnant. So, of course, I see myself as one of those women who was desperate to work, desperate to have a voice in the world. And how on earth was I going to use it? And here was Reuters, where I really thought I could make a mark. I'd always wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and they'd sacked me. And then we came to live in New York, and I had 2 years in New York. And I got a contract to write a book about samplers. And what I tried to show was how women used their creativity beyond merely making a pretty picture. I do think samplers are quite subversive in a way. But then I moved on to Enid and Laura, who certainly used, actually, Laura was manipulative. And you could argue that Mother Teresa was manipulative, and I don't like to
Well,
think of
Mother
myself.
Teresa, was hiding behind a cloak of, you know,
Yeah.
I don't know. I was so glad to finally see her. Look, none of us want to be remembered as the best thing we've ever done or the worst thing we've ever done. There's perspective. She can be two things. Mother Teresa can have done wonderful things, and she can also be not a perfect person. And I love presenting women that way,
No, I absolutely agree. You can juggle several balls at the same time. I wouldn't say it's not that she's not a perfect person. I would say that she engaged with the real world. She was a pragmatist, and there were deeply religious people who thought that to admit that was to denigrate Mother Teresa. I didn't. Like you, I felt that made her much more believable. She was a woman I could understand and get to grips with. So I didn't feel I was denigrating her to show that she had this very practical side, and raking in the money was one of them. But some people didn't like it. I don't think that detracts from what she did. But the supreme manipulator, of course, is Wallis Simpson. And I think women had to be manipulators often in order to exert their influence. And actually Jenny Churchill too. So I guess manipulating and using influence are two sides of the same
Well, and
coin.
maybe, it's funny because men are never described as manipulating. They're not. Only women are. But maybe what we need to do is redefine the word to make it not such a negative connotation. Maybe women now, we are the larger group on the planet. We do have agency, we do have power. And maybe one of the things we need to do is to not allow the patriarchal situation that we're in to give language to us that defines us with a negative connotation that doesn't, I don't know any woman who hasn't manipulated. I've done it. I don't know anybody who does anything of worth and otherwise that doesn't use manipulation. And by the way, so do men. It's not, they just aren't described that way. Oh, she's a manipulator. You don't hear them say, oh, he's a manipulator. Have you ever heard anyone say that about a man? Ever?
No, it is associated with women. It's a way of putting it is compromise. And I guess actually women are very good at compromising. I mean, I learned a few things along the way looking at these women. And one of the things I learned from my book on women reporters is that they certainly manipulated. They manipulated the generals who they wanted stories from. But, men would use a different method to get up to the front lines at a time when women often weren't. So they got stories from hospitals and other places that were considered soft news. Well, we know now that isn't soft news, that's the real news. Did they manipulate by getting to the phone lines more quickly, by sleeping with an influential general here or there, or just making eyes at him? They didn't necessarily actually need to sleep with them, but they learned how to get the story. You can say that's manipulating, or you can say it's using the talents that they had. I mean, the real talent that I discovered women have is being able to listen, and often just being able to listen and not interrupt. Men feel, oh, this is wonderful, I've got someone listening to my story, and they then say far more than otherwise they would say. And a good woman reporter would not see that as anything negative, because she's been trained. Being a good listener, I remember being taught at school, is the art of being a good conversationalist. Not actually to say anything yourself, just to listen. It's a very useful trait when you're trying to get a story out of someone as a journalist.
My second husband, I referred to him as H2, fabulous man, father of my child, um, big investment banker. And I remember we went to a dinner and I was seated next to somebody very famous. And at the end of the dinner, when we were on our way home, H2 said, I don't know what you said to him. He said you were the most fascinating conversationalist he's ever sat next to at dinner. And I said, oh. He said, what did you tell him about? Like,
Yeah.
where did that come from? And I said, I asked him questions about himself. He doesn't know anything about me. We didn't have a conversation. We we had
Well,
a we,
you've absolutely got to the nub of it. And I don't like generally to say women are this and men are the other, but actually women have been trained to be good listeners. And I personally, I don't find that difficult. I am intensely interested in other people. And if
well,
you go to a
I am too, but I will sometimes say at the end of a dinner, I'll say to myself, if they didn't ask you one question about yourself, I'm not sure, and I don't care who they are, I'm not sure I want to sit next to them the next time. I don't know. I'm just saying, and I think we do know how to listen. And then I like to think that I take what I've learned, because there's always something to learn about anybody you're seated next to. I take what I learn and I take it somewhere else. Now, there's one exception that I want to just say on this interview, and we can cut it out if you're uncomfortable with it. But I sat next to Donald Trump at a dinner in the 80s. And everyone at the table was a table of 8. It was a big event, but it was a table of 8. And I was seated next to him, and he had no interest in me. I didn't have the legs or the breasts or anything that he was, interested in. Anyway, it was so horrendous. The only time I've never learned anything from anyone I've sat next to for 2 hours. What was interesting was he said these outrageous things, and no one at the table responded with, why are you saying that? Everybody just couldn't wait to leave the table. And I think one of the things that enabled a Trump-like personality to get out there is because people just weren't willing to confront certain things. So one of the things I've learned about listening and not putting your opinion in because the person's not going to want to hear it is that we've got to find a way to be able to do both, because that was wrong. I had an opportunity to say to him, I think you're crazy. I think you're evil, and I hope I never have to sit next to you again. I could have said that. So I don't know. I think we have to find a better balance.
Interesting.
What? Yeah. I think
that's I wouldn't.
You wouldn't have either.
I wouldn't have.
But did that enable him to get to where he got to is something that haunts me on a small version. I'm just saying, I think women also, yes, we need to continue to listen that way. And isn't that great? At the same time, we also have to learn how to stand up when something has crossed a line toward us. And I'm just learning to do that now. I just want to say that. All right. But when we look at some of the women that your biographies address, and your biographies are very different from others, which is why I am constantly telling people to read them. You do go into more than just how people perceive them now. You go into more than what happened. You go into why did it happen? Why did they become the way they did? So I can't help but wonder, what makes you choose somebody? All right, I know now you're saying Laura Ashley, you were in New York, it sort of worked that way. But I'm thinking you're choosing all the women you're writing about, certainly now, right? The last 3 or 4 books. Okay, who have you not written about that you wished you had or you want to?
Oh, goodness.
Well,
somebody safely dead, I think, and probably not a literary biography. I don't have a particular urge to write about anybody royal. I certainly don't want to go down that route. I didn't see Wallis Simpson as a royal book. I just thought she was somebody who absolutely changed history. And you might not like her, but she'd certainly been misunderstood and needed a second hearing. I mean, I love the way you ask me, how do I choose these subjects, as if I can just write about anyone I like. Well, I have a certain following at the moment, but you can't write about anyone. Publishers are very keen to make you do a proposal. It never used to be like that. You used just to be able to say, well, this would be interesting. I don't know
Well,
whether
wait, two things on that. Help us with that. The first one is you said I have to do safely dead. Define safely dead for me, Anne. What
oh,
does that
oh,
mean?
it means that I had a libel suit on my biography of Enid Bagnold. Not Enid had died, but one of the women who had an affair with her husband sued me, and so I thought I was very careful then, but I would not write about people who are alive. Actually, it's not just for the practical side of the libel suit. I think the dust hasn't settled. So I think the early 19th century is probably too early, but the later 19th century, when women were starting to have a voice and fighting, the suffragettes are eminently relatable. They really were fighting to become to have the vote. The early doctors, the early headmistresses who were responsible for teaching this army of intelligent girls. What were they going to do? I think those sort of group biographies are really interesting, but I just find the horrors of the last century. I can't somehow get myself away. I won't write another Holocaust book. I think probably I need to find a brighter subject, but it mattered to me, and Ethel mattered to me. She somehow came into my head, and I couldn't ignore the fact of how she had been perceived and what an extraordinarily unfair trial she'd had and how she developed in prison. All those things. I just couldn't let go of her. But women against the odds, women spies, incredibly courageous, and they hadn't been educated to expect that they would have to take on those very dangerous roles. Courage in wartime is hardly rare among women, but it's not something that's expected of them. So I haven't got.
Yeah, I just recently wrote a piece. It's the 25th anniversary of the Clinton Monica Lewinsky affair, which I think was very much like Ethel Rosenberg. Like they didn't even call it the Clinton affair. They called it scandal. They called it the Monica Lewinsky scandal. I mean, she was a 21-year-old kid, he was the most powerful man on the globe. It's funny because she's alive, but what I'm seeing in your books and some of the women I'm looking at now, by the way, one of the things you like to write is how they reinvent themselves. Monica Lewinsky has reinvented herself in a really wonderful, wonderful way. And I have great admiration. I think she was courageous when it happened. I mean, there's all kinds of similarities. One of the reasons I think it's so important to read the biographies that you write is because you will all of a sudden read something about today and say, you know what? I think that same thing is happening here. Here, there's a repetition to women and why they have to recreate themselves, reinvent themselves, etc. And I think that's why the books are so important as a collection. Maybe you should do a collection of them, and they've all got the same.
You're very kind. Perhaps you can speak to my publisher, but you're absolutely right. I think the dust probably hasn't settled on Monica Lewinsky, but I'm full of admiration for everything she's done and how she was completely at the hands. I mean, it is quite similar to Ethel. She was a woman in the toils of men without agency, and she's rediscovered that. Remarkably brave and courageous, but who knows what she'll go on to do. And I hope she does have a platform to do all
by
that.
the way, I think she's growing in her platform. She just wrote a piece for Vanity Fair. She's writing and so, she's handling herself so brilliantly. And he's not. He's still complaining about what happened. And then he was recently asked in an interview, did you ever apologize to Monica? And he said, I apologized to the world. It's not the same thing, So he did not have the same growth that she did. I'm just, setting that aside. Okay. a lot of writers read these or listen and watch the interviews that we do, and you're talking a lot about how you have to manipulate or compromise with publishers. I'm adding the word manipulate in there as sort of a joke, tongue in cheek, but it is one of the things. It's called negotiation. You know, you don't get everything you want. They don't get everything they want. You have to sort of walk those lines. Any advice for how you have been able to do it so successfully?
Well, not really. It hasn't always been easy. I've had lots, I could have spent a year researching some obscure 19th century woman who wrote, somebody who comes to mind, for example, is Countess Blessington, who was absolutely intriguing. Yes,
Wait,
you've never
wait,
heard
I
of
don't,
her.
I've
So
never even heard of her. Why is she intriguing?
she was a writer. She knew Byron. She carved out her own life against the odds and was married to appalling men, but had friendships with other men. But there's no a publisher would commission a book on her because she's not known. So all I can say is I learned a lot by researching characters like that. And there are several others. I mean, I've got a drawer full of proposals of interesting minor characters that I'd like to write about. Or, my own grandmother who was on the stage from the age of 14 with Charlie Chaplin and came from a very impoverished family. But she's not known and there aren't documents, so you just put it down to research and learning and move on, because actually I think the only advice is to find a character who publishers can really get behind. Otherwise you only write to reach an audience. There's no point in writing for your bottom drawer.
Okay, to that end, I heard you just say that you spent a year researching her. I guess that's before okay, that's a long time, Anne, to look at something and then not do anything with it, in my mind, especially in today's world where time, in my mind, is our most valuable commodity. Okay. So what I'm sort of hearing you say is, look, I find a character that I think I can pitch to the publisher and I can give them an angle that will make them say, yes, there's a market to sell this book. That's what I'm hearing you say. Okay. Is that right?
I guess it is, except that, when I proposed Ethel Rosenberg, there was some pushback in this country from people who said, who is Ethel Rosenberg? We'd never heard of her.
Well,
Well, I
she's
guess
dead.
you
You
could
can't hear
say,
of her. We killed her.
well,
That's
in
what happened.
America, but it's quite different in England. So either I had reached a certain level that the publishers were prepared to allow me to do this, or you could say I was so utterly passionate I was going to do that anyway. And I think that's probably the case. The women in wartime Paris was because there were so many women. I felt that the story simply hadn't been adequately covered, but I didn't want to go for one name like Chanel or Catherine Dior. Interesting though they were, I thought that the story was much more complicated. So the
Well, Chanel.
name,
I've just read a Chanel biography. I had no idea that's how she became Chanel. I had no idea from when she came. It was fascinating. Really a good story. Okay, so Anne, you're right. You're at a certain point where you can sort of pick and choose, but I was talking with your Ethel Rosenberg book. I was speaking with somebody who is a producer of films, happens to be a man. And I said, this should be a film. It should be a film. And has it been sold to be a film yet? No.
well, it
And
actually has, or it was, and the option is just coming up because unfortunately, I think with Putin going into Ukraine, the idea is how can you make a film about a woman who thought that Russia was wonderful? Well, that so begs the question because she became a communist in 1936 when probably, I would have done because it was the way to beat the dictators, to beat Nazism. And so, as a historian, you have to see a story in its time. But Putin hasn't done me any favors. And so the option is just coming up. So please introduce me to this
Well,
nice
it's
man.
interesting what he said. He took a look at the book, and here's what he said back. He said, "Why would I want to produce a movie that makes men in power look so bad when we're already suffering from that?" Which it's a very interesting point, because Kate Winslet has just launched a film at the Toronto Film Festival. It's called Lee, and it's about a woman a woman in the field, a photographer in wartime, and
I've seen it. I've
okay,
seen it in draft.
okay, so as she was being interviewed at the end of it, and I wanted to bring it up in this context, she said, "Look, I really had a lot of trouble because, you know, one director, producer, money man that we went to said, 'Well, if you will star in my next film, I'll make your little film.'" And she's like, "It's not a little film. You know, I'm not taking your money." And then another producer, money person, said the same thing that I was said to about your book. And he said to her, "Lee, you're not making Lee appealing to me. She needs to be appealing to men." And she said, "You know, I don't even know how to respond to that." Okay. And what she was saying is,
Well,
she's so grateful that women no longer have to depend on men to make that decision. Maybe what you need to do with Ethel is you need to go to some of the great women money people in Hollywood now and say, "Look, they don't want to make this film." That part of that is, just to put it out there, I think that's probably where you'll get the money to do it, you know.
well, that's really interesting. But let me just answer your first question. Why would I want to make a film that makes men look so bad, men in power? It makes some men look bad. I think my book really is redemptive. You could say it's about two dysfunctional families. It starts off with Ethel's birth family, the green glasses, and they're really dysfunctional. And it's her mother who's the appalling member of that. Actually, her father was supportive. And it ends with a very redemptive family, the Mirapols, who adopt these two boys aged 10 and 6, who have not only been orphaned, but they've been orphaned in the most horrific
And
circumstances, where the
public,
whole of
in a
yes,
public
and
way
public. And yet they have turned into responsible citizens, delightful men, both of them, college professors, a lawyer. They've had stable home lives. How? Well, I think because Ethel must have given them good mothering in those early years. I think she did the right thing, but also because the people who adopted them, who were communists, the Mirapols, resigned from the Communist Party and brought them up. And it's a really fine line to respect their birth parents, because after all, they're the people who gave them life, but actually not to turn them into martyrs, not to mythologize them. And so I don't think it does make all men look appalling. I think it's a much more nuanced picture of how people can behave.
I think that, it's funny because I think it's easy for us to say that being women. I think men right now are very sensitive to the fact that they're under attack, and that the world they knew and ruled and, were power brokers in, is not going to respond the way it always did. And they're trying to find a new pathway. And even good men are finding it difficult. I don't know what to say anymore. I don't, they're very, very careful with words in a way that I don't think is necessarily helpful. If you have to worry too much about every single thing you say, you stop saying anything, So I think it's a transitionary time where we're getting, much more vocal, and we don't have as much to lose, and they are trying to find their way. So I can understand why some of these men are saying, I just don't want to get behind a film like that. I don't even know I can't even go to a dinner party without being attacked for being a white man over 60. I'm just, this country is maybe even more than in America, but that's very interesting what you're saying. Okay. So Anne, a couple of things. If you were to start writing biographies of living people, would you approach it differently? In other words, when you say, you want to write about somebody who's no longer here, is it easier to do that, or it's not?
That was slightly facetious, actually.
Yeah.
It was a
Okay.
quick fire answer to
Okay.
your question. I'm fascinated by the times we're living through and totally echo what you're saying, that if I were bringing up a son at this point, I would find it very, very difficult. And I do understand that, but I think it is a pendulum, and I think it'll swing back. I mean, we've seen too many men in power take advantage of women. I don't know whether you have the same stories in America as we do, but there's hardly a day that goes by without some man making an offensive comment about a woman. And you don't find women on air, generally speaking, making offensive comments. I mean, they have other mistakes. I'm not saying women are perfect, but it is difficult, and I think it's a time of readjustment. I love being a journalist. I love getting a handle on stories that are current. So actually, I certainly would write about somebody who's alive, because you could have a lot
I'm gonna
more
start shooting you
interviews.
emails. Everybody starts shooting her emails with ideas, and she'll put them in the file and look at them when she's done, because you have to only do one
Yeah.
thing at a time. There's one last thing I wanted to ask you about. I'm sorry for the loss of your husband. 49 years. You met when you were teenagers. It was a few years ago. You said something after he passed away, was that one of the adjustments you had to make is you had to reinvent yourself, and you tell a wonderful story about changing a light bulb, which I hope you don't mind recounting today. But it's been a couple of years, so now I want to ask you: did you reinvent yourself, and how did you do it? How are you presenting yourself now that's different than who you were as his
Thank you. It's
wife?
such a cliched story,
No,
changing a
not at
light
all.
bulb.
Not at all.
We had our roles. We were a fairly old-fashioned unit, I guess, and changing light bulbs was his role, but I can do it. And there are lots of things that are really empowering, getting out a hammer or a screwdriver, and being able to do something without having to call somebody out to do it is empowering. But that's not reinventing myself. I mean, I'm just a woman getting on with my life. I'm quite pleased I can still earn a living at this advanced age, and that I'm in demand. That I guess we had a different plan. We thought we would go traveling on my own.
By the way, you're always
Traveling on.
hiking. You're hiking somewhere, and I think, God, I got to start hiking. And then I look outside. I'm not going to do that. But
Well, and I'm going to
you are
Australia for
always on the
6.
move. Yeah. What?
Well, you know, I was brought up in a very old-fashioned way, and I've been constantly kicking against that, because it's very, very rewarding. But I don't want to overdo it, because actually I think being a writer is a very, very privileged job, and it's something that I can juggle a bit, and I can still help my own kids with their children. I love being a grandmother at this point in my life. Of course, it's more fun to do things with other people, but I've got an army of widows I can do things with. I don't actually need to have a spouse, which is not that I don't miss him. Of course I do, but lots and lots of possibilities out there. I don't think I should call it anything so grand as reinventing myself. I do take inspiration from the book I'm writing about Auschwitz, and they just live from one day to the next. And if you ask any of these women how they survived, they didn't look to what they would do after. They just wanted to live to tomorrow. Well, that's good enough for me, as long as I can finish this book and see what else that there is out there. It's I'm one of many who is just flying solo at the moment, and that's fine.
Great. And then we ask three quick fire questions at the end of my interviews now. Okay, Anne, first question. What are you reading?
Well, a book I've just finished, which I'm reading as a judge for a prize, is Doppelganger by Naomi Klein. And it's really much more than about her relationship with the other Naomi, Naomi Wolf. It's really about the mirror image of the world. So it's a fascinating book, and I would
Is it
certainly
out?
recommend
I
that.
don't think I've read about it. Is it already out or it's going to be coming out?
I maybe it's coming out shortly. It's
Okay.
imminent, but it could be out already.
Do you
I
know
don't
who's
know.
publishing it so we can keep an eye on it and we'll let everybody know? We'll look it up.
Um,
Not to worry, not to worry.
yeah, I'd have to Google. I don't know.
Uh, wow, Naomi Wolf, interesting woman. You might want to think about writing about her one day.
No, 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 no. Thank you.
Okay, there you go. Okay. All right. And then the second thing is if I'm coming to dinner, what's your go-to thing you make that you're always confident will work?
Oh, well, I don't eat meat, so it's salmon. I'm afraid really boring. I'm sorry not to give you anything
Oh no,
more
no,
exciting,
not. I
but
mean, frankly, I love salmon. I love it. I love it raw. I love it any way you can give it to me. So
yeah,
yeah, that's really good.
I can
Just
do
had
that.
somebody recently who answered the question. I have a great takeout place, and I feel really confident that they deliver the food for me. But I think that's fine. I love that answer. It's like whatever whatever you're going to do, you're going to do. And are you watching anything on television or at the movies?
Oh, no, the last great film I saw was Oppenheimer, and I want to go and see that again.
I know I have to see it
Um,
again too. I could not take it in. It's like going to see Hamilton. It's so quick on
yeah,
you that if you miss a moment, you've lost a lot. So I do think it's one of those films you have to see more than once. Yeah.
I will. And because the scenery is so fabulous, and I went to Los Alamos as part of my research, I loved that. But I need to see it again. Brilliant acting and just so much to think about. So that's still on my mind.
Well, Anne, thank you so much for taking this time. And I'm sure we'll be talking to each other in a couple of years. And the next time you're in New York or the next time in London, we're going to have lunch. So thank you.
You are very kind. I love talking to you. Thank you for everything. Bye now.